Hello, my name is Madeline Dukes, and I am a student at Chattahoochee Technical College. For my history project, I'll be discussing one of the most pivotal court cases in American history, Brown versus the Board of Education. Brown versus the Board of Education paved the way for integration and was a major victory of the civil rights movement and a model for many future cases. Brown versus the Board of Education was a landmark decision by the U.S. Supreme Court, which ruled that U.S. state laws establishing racial segregation in public schools are unconstitutional. Underlying case began in 1951 when the public school system in Topeka, Kansas refused to enroll black resident Olivia Brown's daughter, Linda, at the elementary school closest to their home. Instead, they required her to ride a bus to a segregated school further away. The Browns filed a class action suit relying on the precedent of Plessy versus Ferguson and its separate but equal doctrine, which eventually worked in their favor, allowing the Supreme Court in May of 1954 to issue a unanimous 9-0 decision in favor of the Browns. Thurgood Marshall and the NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund handled this case. Thurgood Marshall was a civil rights lawyer and later became the first African American Supreme Court justice. While working as a lawyer, he argued 32 cases before the Supreme Court and won 29 of them. Thurgood Marshall argued that facilities could not actually be separate but equal when it comes to schools. Schools for white students would receive far more funding than those for black students. During Brown versus Board of Education, Marshall argued to the Supreme Court that the only justification for continuing to have separate schools was to keep people who were slaves as near that stage as possible. Therefore, Marshall brought in social sciences, which states that segregated schools gave black children a sense of inferiority. The Brown versus Board decision didn't stem from a single case. There were a group of 5 lawsuits that started in 1952. School districts in South Carolina, Delaware, Virginia, Washington, D.C., and Topeka, Kansas. Now, of course, the case in Topeka, Kansas was the case of Olivia Brown. So we'll discuss the following 4 cases involved in the Brown versus Board of Education. In South Carolina, the Briggs versus Elliott case was named for Harry Briggs, one of the 20 parents who brought suit against R.W. Elliott, the president of the school board of Clarendon County, South Carolina. In 1947, Washington, D.C., Gardner Bishop and the Consolidated Parents Group, Incorporated, began a crusade to end segregated schools in Washington, D.C., as 11 young African American students were turned away from the newly completed John Philip Salsa Junior High School, although the school had several empty classrooms. In April of 1951 in Farmville, Virginia, high school student Barbara Rose Johns organized a 2-week student strike to protest poor school conditions. The students believed that the conditions of the school deprived them of equal educational opportunities. Moton High School had no gymnasium, no cafeteria, no infirmary or teachers' restrooms, and the overflow of students was in an old school bus and 3 buildings covered in tar paper. Lastly, in Delaware, there were 2 separate cases, but the issues were the same. Black families were frustrated with the unfair conditions in schools reserved for African American children. These 5 cases were combined into a single case that became known as Brown versus the Board of Education. In the southern United States, especially the Deep South, where racial segregation was deeply entrenched, the reaction to Brown versus Board of Education among most white people was noisy and stubborn. Many Southern government and political leaders put a plan in place known as massive resistance. which was created by Virginia Senator Harry F. Byrd in order to disturb attempts to desegregate their school systems. As recently as 1950, segregation was common nationwide across the U.S. It was not until the Supreme Court ruled on Brown versus Board of Education 4 years later that segregation laws began to lose legal standing. Segregation of schools violated the 14th Amendment, which declares that no state shall deprive any person of life, liberty, or property. Due to the 1954 Supreme Court ruling of Brown versus the Board of Education, which ordered all schools to desegregate, in 1960, Ruby Bridges was chosen as one of 6 children to integrate the all-white William Frantz Public School. At the age of 6 years old, Ruby Bridges changed history and became the first African-American child to integrate an all-white elementary school in the South. There was public outcry due to the integration of the all-white school. The Bridges family suffered for their decision to send her to William Frantz Elementary, as her father lost his job as a gas station attendant, and in turn her parents separated. Although it was backlash from the community, there were others in the community, both black and white, that showed support in a variety of ways, according to Ruby. Another monumental moment deriving from the Brown versus Board of Education decision was the integration of the Little Rock Central High School in 1957. The NAACP had registered 9 black students to attend the previously all-white Little Rock Central High, selected on the criteria of excellent grades and attendance, now known as the Little Rock Nine. They were the first African-American students to desegregate Little Rock Central High in Arkansas. However, it wouldn't be until the end of September 1957 when the plan was finalized and the 9 teens were admitted to Little Rock Central High under the protection of the 101st Airborne Division. But they were still subjected to a year of physical and verbal abuse by many of the white students. In the end, both Ruby Bridges and the Little Rock Nine helped to end segregation of schools. Brown versus the Board of Education case did not change the country overnight, but it did have a major impact on the civil rights movement. For several decades after the Brown decision, African American teachers, principals, and other school staff who worked in segregated black schools were fired or laid off as Southerners sought to create a system of integrated schools with white leadership. In North Carolina, the transition to a fully integrated school system did not begin until 1971. After numerous local lawsuits and both nonviolent and violent demonstrations. However, the Brown versus Board of Education verdict acted as a catalyst for the end of legal segregation and provided a precedent for further lawsuits against segregation, guaranteeing its place as a glorified moment in the civil rights movement. In that, it inflicted changes all over the United States, extended from housing desegregation to access to higher education for all people. Brown versus the Board of Education entitled students to receive a quality education regardless of their racial status. It also allowed African American teachers to teach in any public school they chose. Today's solutions are much less focused on social and cultural benefits of integration. They are concentrated more on how to build the kinds of learning opportunities necessary to close existing achievement gaps and ensure that all students can become proficient based on our national standards. In conclusion, it is important today and going forward. We need changes that serve the needs of poor and middle class communities. We need schools that not only serve our country's economic objectives, but also strengthen our young people, their families, and our communities.